I always thought the view from the 32nd floor would feel like victory. This morning, with Manhattan glittering below and the early sun catching the glass towers in a pale gold shimmer, it feels more like quiet defiance. The city hums far beneath me, but in here the only sound is the low, steady whir of the HVAC and the occasional ping of my phone against the mahogany desk. I smooth the sleeve of my cream silk blouse, a nervous habit I can't seem to break, and glance at the clock. In less than an hour, I'll be on stage at the Midtown Women in Leadership Summit, my name printed in bold on the program. A sold-out ballroom waits downstairs. Years of building my company, of late nights and risky decisions, have led me here. My phone vibrates again. The name flashing across the screen stops my breath cold. Mark Reynolds. Mark. My former manager. The man who spent years pocketing my ideas and basking in the applause they earned. The man who once looked me straight in the eye after stealing yet another pitch and said, "You're just not cut out for this job." I stare at the glowing screen, thumb hovering but not answering. The sting of those words lives in my bones even now. Though I've built an empire he could never imagine. For a heartbeat, the old hurt flickers, a memory as sharp as the day it was spoken. And just like that, the past I've kept buried begins to rise. For years ago, I was 24 and still believed that hard work spoke louder than politics. The marketing floor at Brightline Tech smelled of burnt coffee and ambition, a low hum of ringing phones and clipped heels on polished concrete. I had been there just over a year, pouring every ounce of myself into campaigns that turned small clients into headline accounts. Mark Reynolds was the kind of manager people pretended to admire. He wore tailored suits and a permanent grin that never reached his eyes. At team meetings, he'd nod at my ideas, then, like clockwork, repeat them later as if they'd sprung from his own brilliance. At first, I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit, as long as the work shone. But the night before our biggest presentation yet, a pitch to secure a multi-million-dollar streaming client, I stayed until midnight refining the deck, rewriting copy until my eyes ached. I even brought in my grandmother's old silver fountain pen, the one she gave me at graduation. "For the day you sign your first real contract," she'd said, her voice warm with the faith I desperately wanted to earn. The next morning, Mark swept into the boardroom carrying my deck. He barely acknowledged me as he launched into the pitch, delivering my carefully crafted strategy word for word. The clients loved it. Applause burst across the room, and he basked in it like sunlight. When the last handshake was done and the clients were gone, he closed the door. His smile flattened into something cold. "Listen, Jenna," my name clipped like an afterthought. "I know you've been trying, but you're just not cut out for this job. Not the way this industry works." I felt my throat tighten until breathing hurt. My nails pressed half-moons into my palms. The hum of the fluorescent lights grew unbearably loud. That campaign, I managed, my voice trembling, was my work. He shrugged, like it was weather we couldn't control. "Sometimes talent isn't enough. You need the right instincts. Maybe you should look elsewhere before this gets harder." I clutched the fountain pen in my bag, its cool weight grounding me as shame and fury tangled in my chest. For a long moment, I stood frozen, the taste of metal in my mouth. Then, without another word, I walked out, past the glass offices, past the reception desk, out into the raw November air. I didn't look back. The first weeks after Brightline were a blur of panic and possibility. My small studio apartment in Queens felt like both a prison and a blank canvas. I spent long days hunched over my second-hand laptop, the hum of the radiator keeping me company as I scoured freelance boards. Money was tight. I stretched every dollar, living on black coffee and whatever vegetables I could coax from the corner market's discount bin. At night, I'd wrap myself in a thrifted wool sweater and rework my portfolio, the silver fountain pen resting beside me like a quiet promise. This isn't the end. My first break came from a startup fashion label in Brooklyn. They couldn't afford a big agency, so they gambled on me, a stranger with a half-finished website and an ambitious pitch. I poured everything into their launch campaign, shooting late-night photos in drafty warehouses, writing copy until dawn. When their social media exploded, so did the referrals. Still, Every small win came with a shadow of doubt. There were nights when exhaustion blurred the lines on my screen and Mark's words echoed, "Not cut out for this job." I would grip that fountain pen until the ridges pressed into my skin and keep going. 6 months in, I met Linda Harper, a veteran brand strategist with a sharp mind and a warmth that reminded me of my grandmother. We crossed paths at a networking brunch where I was the youngest at the table by a decade. After listening to my story, Linda leaned closer and said, "Don't waste energy proving him wrong. Prove yourself right." Linda became my quiet mentor. She didn't coddle me. She challenged me. She set my work to contacts she trusted and made me defend every creative choice. Under her guidance, I learned to pitch with confidence, to price my work without apology, to negotiate like an equal. Within a year, my client list stretched coast to coast. I registered Jenna Miles Creative, a boutique agency built on authenticity and bold storytelling. I turned down flashy interviews and kept my social media sparse. Let the work speak. Let success grow quietly. By the second year, I hired my first 2 employees, both women with the same hungry fire I once carried alone. We worked out of a small loft near Union Square, sunlight spilling across exposed brick and stacks of mood boards. Every time we signed a new client, I used that silver fountain pen. Not for superstition, though maybe a little, but because it reminded me that my grandmother's faith, and my own, mattered more than Mark's dismissal ever could. I never posted photos of the office or the growing list of Fortune 500 clients. Old colleagues from Brightline occasionally messaged me, curious about what I was up to. I kept it vague. "Keeping busy," I'd reply, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Quiet success was its own kind of power, and somewhere deep down, I knew the day would come when the silence would end, when the world, and maybe even Mark Reynolds himself, would see exactly what I'd built. 3 years to the day after I walked out of Brightline, I stood in the corner office of Miles and Harper Creative, sunlight slanting through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city below gleamed like an endless promise. Our company, my company, had just closed a deal to acquire a boutique agency whose name still carried weight in corporate boardrooms. That agency was Brightline. I hadn't planned the timing. The opportunity simply aligned. But when the paperwork landed in my inbox, a quiet surge of justice warmed my chest. The official introduction meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. I arrived early, letting the space settle around me. My grandmother's silver fountain pen rested on the polished walnut table, the same pen that had carried me through every contract since that November morning. Its presence steadied me now. At precisely 10, the door opened and a cluster of Brightline staff filed in, led by a familiar figure, Mark Reynolds. He looked older. His once perfectly slicked hair had thinned. The sharpness in his suit couldn't hide the slump in his shoulders. His eyes scanned the room, then snagged on the name etched on the glass wall behind me. Jenna Miles, co-founder and chief creative officer. For a heartbeat, the air thickened. "Good morning," I said, my voice smooth-measured. "Thank you for coming." Mark's eyebrows drew together. He stopped himself, the word hanging like a loose thread. "Yes," I said, allowing a small smile. "I'm leading the team that now owns Brightline." Silence. I watched the flicker of recognition chase across his face. Surprise, confusion, a flash of something that looked almost like fear. You're running this?" His voice cracked slightly. "I am," I said. "And we're excited to welcome your team into our family. But first, there are a few changes we need to discuss." I gestured toward the seating area. My partner Linda, poised and calm, slid a folder across the table. Inside were the new organizational charts, our vision for a culture built on collaboration and transparency. Mark opened the folder, his hands trembling almost imperceptibly. He cleared his throat. "You're acquiring us?" "That's correct." I met his gaze steadily. "We're restructuring to ensure credit is given where it's due. Creativity deserves recognition, not theft." The words landed between us like a carefully placed stone. Around the table, the Brightline employees exchanged quiet glances. I caught one young woman biting back a grin. Mark's lips parted, but no defense came. The room seemed to hold its breath. I leaned forward slightly, the silver pen cool between my fingers. Years ago, you told me I wasn't cut out for this job. I let the memory sharpen just enough to make the truth undeniable. Turns out I was cut out to run the whole company instead. A faint color rose in his cheeks, whether shame or anger, I couldn't tell. Linda broke the silence with a professional brightness. Shall we move on to the transition plan? Mark gave the smallest nod, his eyes dropping to the documents. For the first time in our history, he had nothing to say. As we began outlining the next steps, the city's late-morning light spilled across the table, glinting off the silver pen. It felt like the sun itself was leaning in, witness to a justice long overdue. I kept my voice even, every word deliberate. This wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. And the man who once stole my ideas now sat quietly, listening, while I charted the course ahead. When the formal introductions ended, Linda excused herself to meet with the Brightline department heads. The door clicked softly behind her, leaving Mark and me alone in the conference room. He lingered near the table, the folder of restructuring plans open but unread. Jenna, his voice held a rasp I didn't remember. I didn't expect. I know, I said, sliding the silver fountain pen into its case. I didn't expect it either. But here we are. He exhaled, shoulders sagging. You've built something incredible. For a moment, I almost let the old anger speak for me. But revenge wasn't why I came back. Growth had a different language. I didn't build this to prove you wrong, I said, my tone calm but unflinching. I built it to prove myself right. That said, there are conditions for Brightline moving forward. His eyes flicked up. Conditions? Yes. I folded my hands, letting the silence stretch. First, every campaign moving forward will carry full, transparent credit. No more behind-the-scenes theft. Talent deserves recognition. Every intern, every strategist. That's non-negotiable. Mark swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet room. Of course. Second, I continued, you'll step down as head of creative. You may stay on as an advisor during the transition if you choose. But leadership will now belong to people who champion ideas, not steal them. His jaw tightened. I saw the old instinct to argue flicker, then fade. If that's what's best for the company, he murmured. It is, I said. And finally, I leaned in slightly, the polished table reflecting both of us. I want you to mentor 2 junior staffers. Teach them everything you know about pitching and client strategy. And this time, give them the credit they earn. Consider it a new legacy. He looked at me, stunned. Why would you, after everything, trust me with that? I gave a small, rueful smile. Because I believe people can change if someone demands it. And because I refuse to become the kind of leader who only knows how to punish. Mark's gaze dropped to the papers before him. For a long moment he said nothing, and the only sound was the faint hiss of the city's steam pipes far below. Then he nodded once, slow and deliberate. I'll do it. I rose, smoothing the sleeve of my navy blazer. Good. Linda will follow up with details. You'll have the support you need, but the standard is clear. As I moved toward the door, Mark spoke again, softer than before. Jenna, I was wrong about you. I paused, hand on the glass handle, but didn't turn. Yes, I said quietly. You were. I stepped into the hallway, where sunlight poured through the tall windows. The warmth on my skin felt like more than morning light, it felt like release. This wasn't about triumph over him anymore. It was about creating the kind of workplace I once needed, one where talent was nurtured, not stolen. And knowing I held the power to shape that future was the sweetest victory of all. The weeks that followed moved like a quiet tide. Brightline staff began to settle into the new rhythm. Ideas pinned proudly to white boards, junior creatives presenting pitches with their names clearly attached. For the first time in years, the halls buzzed with a kind of optimism that wasn't laced with fear. Linda and I walked those halls often, listening more than we spoke. We watched Mark keep his promise. He coached 2 young strategists, both women barely out of college, and for once he stood behind them instead of in front. I saw him step back during presentations, allowing their voices to carry the room. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was real. One rainy afternoon, I returned to my own office to sign the final set of merger documents. The city outside was blurred in shades of silver and blue. On my desk lay my grandmother's fountain pen, its weight as familiar as my own heartbeat. I unscrewed the cap, the faint scent of ink rising like a memory. I thought of that November morning when humiliation burned hot in my chest. I thought of the late nights alone, of Linda's challenge, prove yourself right, and of every quiet victory that followed. I signed my name slowly, each letter a testament to a journey no one else could measure. When the last stroke of ink dried, I set the pen down and let the silence fill the room. It wasn't revenge that warmed me. It was something deeper, a calm recognition of who I'd become. I'd built a company where ideas belonged to the people who created them. I'd turned a wound into a foundation, a dismissal into a calling. My phone buzzed with another calendar reminder, tomorrow's keynote at the Women in Leadership Summit. I smiled, picturing a ballroom full of young professionals, women who might be hearing no for the first time and wondering if it defined them. It didn't. It never had. I slipped the fountain pen back into its case and stood, the city lights beginning to glow in the drizzle beyond the glass. Turns out, I thought, a quiet pride threading through every word, I was cut out for this job after all, just not the small one he tried to keep me in. The rain tapped softly against the window, as if in agreement.